Welcome back, everyone. Sheepdog Smokey here, and we're seeing a bit of a hopeful turn when it comes to Venezuela. We have Ramon Rangel, an Air Force general, who's calling on the military there to rise up, to remove Maduro, who he very much likely says that he is being someone who's been controlled by communist Cuba. And we know that the communist nations all over the world are looking at Venezuela and they are hell bent to keep it from, in their mind, falling to democracy. But you see, it happens all over the world. When you look at any communist nation, that unless there is just brutal subjugation 24/7, they fall. You look at 1990, I believe it was 19, it was either 89 or 90. It was after George Herbert Walker Bush assumed office, and the wall in Berlin fell, thanks mostly, if not completely, due to Ronald Reagan and his policy with regard to Gorbachev. But the Russian Soviet Union fell and splintered into multiple independent states. That's it will one day happen in Venezuela. And the question is really only how many people will still be alive to see it. We've seen horrific video coming out of Venezuela of military vehicles running into crowds and of people burning money or using it as toilet paper. A kid used Venezuelan money to make a purse because the money's useless. Empty stores, people eating from the trash, eating their pets. Venezuela is in the final death throes of a communist nation. It's just a question of how long those death throes of the communist nation will last. You have Guaido, the non communist socialist party leader, who has been and has claimed he is now the president of Venezuela due to the election that Maduro rigged. He's been recognized by multiple nations. When you have Russia telling those nations, do not get involved in Venezuela, you know Russia backs Maduro. If there was ever a final nail in the Russian collusion coffin, it's the fact that Donald Trump has basically thumbed his nose at Moscow and said, we're going to stand by Guaido. But now we have members of their armed forces telling the people and the other members of the other rank and file members of the armed forces it's time to rise up. And here's what Maduro is probably thinking and where he's wrong. You see, the ultra top brass of the Venezuelan military stands with him because he makes them rich. He brings them to his palace where they're fed steak and lobster and caviar, drinking to their heart's content. They have everything they could ever want. They're, of course, favored pawns of the dictator. But the rank and file members are not being paid enough to survive. They're not being fed well. And now they're seeing leaders in their branches telling them to rise up. If we want to look at it throughout history, both real and fiction, there's only a few examples you need to look at. If we go back several hundred years, well, a little more than 1,000, we go to ancient Sparta. Sparta was a very warfaring and military society where all men served in the army and served until they could not physically ever again, meaning that they would come home and be a baker or a potter or a shepherd, but they always had their spear and their shield at the ready, and they would march to war when called. Being that you had very few men, as Sparta was always involved in a war somewhere, it seems, they were also a slave-owning state. And in actuality, as part of the agoge, the training that young men were sent to in their very early adolescence, they were to kill a slave, and if they got caught, they were punished. So the slaves, seeing this, decided, wait, there's more of us than there are of them. And they rose up, and they overthrew their masters. We look at the slave revolt that is very famous for the fictional novelization and television and movie presentation of Spartacus. This would be ancient Rome, where the slaves realized the same thing. There are more of us than there are of them. We have been well trained by them in their own tactics. They rose up, and they won. We flash forward several years to the 1770s. You see, the young colonies of the U.S. continent, of the American continent, had been mistreated by their king for years upon years, taxed to pay for his wars and his luxuries. And when one tax was just too much, we threw a bunch of tea into the ocean, which angered the Brits, of course, and they were sent to the U.S. colonies, or to the American colonies, with orders to disarm the colonists. That, of course, culminated in Lexington and Concord and the shot heard round the world. Flash forward a few years, and we have the end of the Revolutionary War, with King George kicked in the pants back to his island, and now the United States of America, who for 13 years would struggle with how to set up a government until George Washington took office, and the ultimate ratification of several things. But more recently, we can look at a much more interesting portrayal of this. And yes, I am going to fiction. I'm going to the Hunger Games, because the Hunger Games actually likens itself to several things throughout history. When you look at it, it is a people being subjugated. And of course, we hear of it being 74 years in the past when we open the first book. Fair warning, if for some reason in the last 7 years you've not read the books or seen the movies, as they've all been out at least that long, you might want to stop now, because I'm going to spoil the living crap out of them. So, spoiler warning given. When we open the book, we hear about the Treaty of the Treason, where the 13 colonies of Panem, which, conveniently enough, are on the North American continent. So, it may or may not have been the 13 regions. It may have been the states rising up against their masters. Now, of course, the book portrays it as having always been Panem, or another country that was renamed Panem, but it's very convenient how it's all on the North American continent in what is the United States. But the 13 regions, or districts, rise up against the capital. They're soundly defeated because, of course, the regions that provide weapons or soldiers are, of course, loyal to the capital, because, much like Maduro's own top brass, they're kept fat and happy. Their own people are basically bribed and plied with whatever they want to ensure the people who are making the guns and bullets and training the people to use them are going to side with the capital. And of course, districts 3 through 13 are quickly and easily put down. In the process, supposedly District 13 is destroyed. District 13 provides the heavier military equipment, planes, tanks, and so on. We then flash forward the 74 years, and we learn of the treaty wherein each district, 1 through 12, agrees that once per year they will provide a young man and young woman between, I believe, the ages of either 12 or 13 and 18. May have been younger than that. I would have to go back and reread to get the ages right, but it's basically from preteen until 18, to compete in the Hunger Games, a brutal battle to the death, with only one person coming out alive. And in the 74th, it ends up being Katniss and Peeta, two very good friends. As the book would lead you on at this point, possible lovers. And they manage to force the capital to declare them co-victor. From there, President Snow decides that this is unfathomable. We get the Quarter Quell at the 75th year in the second book, where Katniss and Peeta are right back in the thick of it. And they manage to be, well, Katniss is rescued by District 13, we learn, which has gone underground, and a revolution begins. The difference is, prior to what the capital calls the treason, which would be the people rising up because their government no longer cares about them, prior to that, they really only had what I will call the basic complaints. You know, food is getting scarce, and the government is not listening to us, and we're being taxed a bit too much. But see, after the Quarter Quell, when Katniss manages to destroy the arena they're in and is taken off by people they thought were gone, who do not have an ounce of care for the capital, we learn that they still have all of those things amplified. Clothing, food, shelter, all, except for maybe Districts 1 and 2, maybe 3, all extremely rare. Getting out of line gets you a beating or worse Food, scarce, taxes, basically 100%. You don't earn anything. You get what the government gives you in response, in thanks for your work, be that food, shelter, or whatever. But now they have 75 years of their children being murdered for sport. And this is where I believe Venezuela almost stands. You take out the Hunger Games, the children, and Venezuela has seen their government take and take and take and take for over a decade. They now look back and realize that when they were disarmed, that was the first step to where they are now. When they were disarmed, they could no longer actually defend themselves from a tyrant. So, of course, now that we have a tyrant sitting in Caracas, that tyrant is using his military. And we're now at the point where we get to at the end of Hunger Games 3 Mockingjay. And that is where you see even the military decide that this is wrong. And I honestly hope for a bloodless battle. I don't ever want to watch people harmed, but I'm watching it now. I'm watching people starve, children starving. I'm watching the military brutalize their own people because a dictator in a mansion says to. And there will come a point where the people will have had enough, and the military will side with them. And it's going to be very tense to watch, but we are witnessing a part of history. And how it ends will be very telling. But I've talked about it long enough. Please remember to like, share, and comment on this video to let me know what you think. But remember, keep the comments civil. We do not learn from argument. We learn from debate. As always, please remember also to subscribe and to turn on notifications so that you are among the first to know of all new content as it is posted. Until next time, everyone have a wonderful day.